everyone, I'm Liz from Thread Faction Studio and welcome to the sew along for the Lake Woven Tee. Okay, we've got all our pieces cut out here already. We've got one front and one back piece cut on the fold. We've got two sleeve pieces mirrored and one piece for the neckline facing there. So we're just going to run through the construction step by step today so you can put your Lake Woven Tee together. Okay, so in a second I'm going to say that the first step to this pattern is to sew your darts, which you can see I've already done, but that is actually not the first step of the pattern. If you were following the instructions, unlike me, you would know that the first step to sewing this pattern is to stay stitch the neckline. So that's on the front and on the back pattern piece. So inside your seam allowance from the top point here into the center front, and the same on the other side, and then the same at the back, and that just stabilizes your neckline so that doesn't stretch out before we get a chance to sew our facing in. So I'll do that now. Okay, now our stay stitching's done, we can move on with darts. All right, we start with the front piece. Now, if you are using the size 1 bust front piece, you won't have a dart, so you can skip this step completely. But for everybody else who has a front dart, we get that one done first. So the first step in the instructions says to cut from this point here to the first dot. So if you have a look, I don't know if you can see from that distance, there is a big dot and a smaller dot. We're going to start with cutting up to the big dot. Just like that. The small dot is actually the dart point, so I'm going to draw some lines in there so you can see what's going on to start with. But there's a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way along this cut edge, and then it tapers to the point. So if you draw a line straight from that 1 centimetre seam allowance there right to the dart point, and then again on this side there's a 1 centimetre seam allowance along the edge of the cut edge there. Now you don't have to draw those lines in, I've just drawn them in so that I can show you where the stitching lines go there. So then all you've got to do is line up the seam allowance along the dart legs, and you'll see that this little dog's leg here lines up exactly with the point from the other side. And then you can see there's stitching lines marked there directly from that little dog's leg right up to the point of the dart. So then it's just a case of stitching along that line and then finishing off the raw edge there with your overlocker or a zigzag stitch, whatever suits. Okay, so I'm just going to go and do that on both sides, both darts, and I'll be back for the next steps. Okay. So now, as you can see, I've sewn the dart and I've finished the seam allowance there with my overlocker, and then just press the dart downwards like this. Alrighty. The next step after darts is to join one of the shoulder seams. So you're going to place your back pattern piece and your front pattern piece together with right sides together, right sides of fabric facing. Line up the shoulder seam. We're going to sew along that shoulder seam with the 1 centimetre seam allowance and then finish off the seam allowance. You can finish them off together with my overlocker. You can obviously do that with the zigzag stitch and then press the seam allowance towards the back. Alright, with one shoulder seam sewn, we can go ahead now and start on the neckline facing. So the first step with your neckline facing is to take your bias cut neckline facing piece, fold it in half lengthways and press it. Just like that. Then open out your front and back pattern pieces. So you can see we've got the neckline opening here, and this is the right side of the fabric. So then you take your neckline facing piece, right side against the right side of the fabric of your main pieces, and just pin that around the opening. The seam line, 6 mil in from the edge, is the same length as the binding piece, so you shouldn't have to do a lot of stretching or easing to get this facing piece to line up. And if it is problematic, possibly go back and check to make sure you've cut the right length facing piece. Make sure that you've cut it on the bias so that it's got that bit of stretch to it, so that when we go to top stitch it down, it's not going to cause puckering. So you can see I'm just pinning the facing piece up against the neckline edge, right sides facing, and the raw edge of the facing piece lined up with the raw edge of the neckline, and the folded edge on this side. Okay. And then we're just going to sew that facing piece to the neckline all the way around the edge with a 6 mil seam allowance. Okay, so there we go. We've got the folded edge of the binding here, and we've sewn this along here with a 6 mil seam allowance all the way around the opening of the neckline. So here's our raw edge here. What we're going to do is fold this folded edge back over the top of the seam allowance. And although it's hard to see in this print here, I'm sure, we're going to run a line of stitching through the binding, the folded binding edge, and through the seam allowance. Just a couple of mils to this side of the seam, so to the binding side of the seam. So just a couple of mils to that side of the seam all the way around, stitching the binding or the facing to the seam allowance around there. So under stitching that facing all the way around. Okay, so that's under stitched there all the way along the edge. You can see multiple lines of stitching on the back because of the the stay stitching of the neckline, the original seam line there, and the understitching. So the next thing we're going to do is, you can see the facing here. And if you fold that back, there's some excess seam allowance there. So we're going to trim down that seam allowance. Make sure you don't trim the facing. But trim the extra seam allowance on the inside here, all the way around the neckline there. I'll speed this bit up so that you don't have to watch the painstaking process. But you get the idea there. Now you can see, the facing with the trimmed seam allowance. Okey-doke. All trimmed up. Right, so that is not the last step to the neckline facing, but before we do the last step, we need to sew the other shoulder shut. So, arrange things now so that the second shoulder is right sides of fabric facing. And pin it together from the edge of the facing all the way to the outside shoulder. Okay, so now we're going to sew this seam with 1 centimetre seam allowance and finish the seam allowance off with the yoke blocker. Okay, shoulder seam sewn and finished and pressed towards the back. Now we're up to the last step on the neckline finish, and that's just to turn the facing to the inside along the seam line and to edge stitch it down along the folded edge all the way around. Just like that. Edge stitching along this edge all the way around. Then after sewing that, you give it a good press, and there you have it. That's what the inside looks like, and the outside with just a single line of stitching. Righty, the next step now is to attach the sleeves. So with your sleeves, you'll notice that one side of the sleeve has a double notch, and that's the back of the sleeve, and the front has just a single notch. And then on the body pieces, again, the front has a single notch and the back has a double notch there. So what you want to do is place the main part of your shirt right side up, and then get the correct sleeve piece. So this is the front of my shirt this side with the dart, so this is the sleeve piece that has the single notch on that side and the double notch on this side to match up with the double notch here at the back of the shirt piece. Now the sleeve has a single notch in the middle that doesn't line up with the shoulder seam here. You'll see there's a notch about 2 centimeters back from the shoulder seam, and that's the center of the sleeve. So make sure we're going to pin this sleeve into this opening, but make sure you take the notch that's at the top of the sleeve and line it up with the notch right there, not the shoulder seam. So then we're going to pin that in place there. So you're doing right side of the sleeve to the right side of the main fabric of the shirt. You're lining up the underarm point and the notches. Again at the front, the underarm point and that front notch. And then add in a few additional pins for the remainder of the seam. There's not a whole lot to ease in on the sleeve cap because this is a drop shoulder design, and the seam line of the seam line on this curve is the same as the seam line on that curve, but the edges aren't exactly the same. So the seam line 1 centimetre in is the same, so you've just got to line that up there, and you'll notice that will line up just like that. So then to sew 1 centimetre seam allowance along there, and then finish the seam allowance edge, and then repeat for the other sleeve. Okay, so shoulder seam sewn and overlocked, and I gave that a good press too on both sides. And while I was at the iron, I did a bit of pre-pressing, which is not in the pattern, but is really handy in making the hemming faster later on. So this hem, the sleeve hem, has a 1 centimetre fold and then a 2.5 centimetre fold. And so if at this stage you press it over by 1 centimetre and then over by 2.5 centimetres and give it a good steam and a press, when you go to sew that hem later on, it makes it a whole lot easier than trying to do that pressing when this seam here is sewn. So I did that on both sleeves, and also at the bottom hem of the front and the back, I just folded it up 1 centimetre and gave it a good press there as well, because that will make the hemming of the bottom easier later on as well. Okay, so the next actual step of the pattern is this side seam, but as we're going to press this seam open, we need to finish the raw edge of the side seams first. So we're going to finish separately both of those raw edges and the same on the other side. Okay, so with that seam allowance finished, we're now going to sew this side seam from the underarm, from the end of the sleeve all the way to the hem. So line up your underarm seams. Okay, so in this side seam, right in the stitch line, there's 2 large dots. So when we sew this first portion of the side seam, we're going to sew from the end of the sleeve down to the first large dot, back stitch and secure the thread tails there, then start again sewing at the second large dot, which is just here, secure our thread tails and continue on to the end. So we'll have our side seam sewn from there down to here. We'll have this part open and unsewn between the 2 large dots, and this portion here at the end sewn. So we'll do that on that side, and then exactly the same on the other side, leaving it the portion between the two large dots in the side seam unsewn at this point. Okay, so after we've sewn this side seam with our seam allowances separately finished there, we're left with this section here that's unsewn like this, and this is the part we're going to use to make our little split hem at the bottom. So what we're going to do here is you take the two sides open them like that, and we're going to sew from this point here to the end, and the same on the other side. So to line that up, do it in one direction first. Can you see we've got, this is the section at the bottom of the hem that's sewn together, and this is the top part of the hem, and this is the folded part on the other side, and we've got that all folded to one side. This is where the large dots are, so they're matched up with each other, and we've just got the one side here. So we're going to pin that. So this is from the large dot to now this new fold that we've made. And keeping all of this out of the way, we're going to sew from the fold down to that where the large dot is on that side. Okay, so you can see I've sewn right up to, but not over, where these parts are, and then we're going to flip this, which is the bottom part of the hem, and this, the bottom part of the side seam, and this, which is the top part of the side seam, back in the other direction. And then we're going to sew the other half of this. So I'll go back through it again from the start. So what we've sewn from the end of the sleeve down to here and down that bit, and then we've opened up the side seam to make it this. We've sewn that one together, and then we're going to sew that one together. So fold all these bits back like that, so none of them get caught in the seam, and then we're sewing from the big spot, big dots again, right back out to this corner here. Okay, so now we've sewn that other side, and we have our side seam sewn like this. And then if we turn each of these out the right way, like that, but turning out the corners, open our side seam out flat, there we have our split in the bottom of the side seam there. So we're going to press all of that. This edge here is where we did that pre-pressing under of 1 centimetre, so we'll be then able to tuck that pre-pressed edge under like that, press it nice and even all the way around, and then we'll be able to do our hemming stitch there. So I'll just sew the other side and press all this up. Okay, so on the side seam, press the side seam open, and here's the two little corners that we pressed out there, so they've been pressed, and then that's the very bottom hem that's now been pressed under along that edge, and the whole bottom pressed up to that same distance there. Okay, so this is pressed, and we're just going to edge stitch around that edge all the way around the bottom of the shirt to hold the hem in place. But to stop that from travelling as you sew, I'm just going to put some pins in to keep that in place all the way around. Same on the back. So we're going to stitch just right along this edge all the way around to hold the hem up. While we're at it, we'll hem the sleeves. So we've pressed over 1 centimetre and then 2.5 centimetres on the sleeve. So now we can fold along those pressed lines. Just like that, and put some pins to hold that in place as well, especially around the bottom here where the seam is, making sure you line up that seam. And then we're going to sew that hem up in exactly the same way as the bottom by stitching right along this folded edge all the way around, and the other sleeve as well. Okay, hem's sewn up. And that is the end of the Lake T-shirt sew along. You have yourself a Lake T-shirt.